From your point of view, as someone who is an oil analyst, give me your take on the energy transition.
Well, I think the energy transition, is absolutely a big part of the conversation right now. I think it's different in different geographies. I think we see a lot of different behaviors in Europe to the Americas, and then of course to developing nations around the globe, right? So energy transition certainly isn't something that's going to be exactly the same and mirrored and kind of tackled in every jurisdiction the same. And so I think it's important that we think about, yes, global demand is still rising. We're seeing very firm demand around the globe, but in different geographies it looks very different. And I think this transition is going to be bumpy. It's going to be really chunky. We're going to see large demand pieces move at different paces. You know, aviation, for example, are we going to see sustainable aviation fuel become a deeper part of the equation? That's going to be geography driven, right? It's really going to be driven by regional or international airlines and how that goes. Well, those are decisions that'll be made that'll turn, large chunks of demand, at a lower carbon alternative over time. So it's those kind of pieces that are going to fall. But you're right. Right now we have firm demand around the globe, and it's on the backs of a lot of developing nations coming out of COVID and economies heating back up. And that's kind of the big pressure right now for public companies, is they're trying to figure out how do we continue to invest and meet demand from our customers around the globe, and at the same time prepare our portfolios and prepare our investments for the things that we need to do for what does it look like 10 years from now, and what and when are those demand signals going to start to play a role.
What are companies thinking about 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now? Are they anticipating, say, peak demand in the early 2030s, like the IEA says, and then wondering about the plateau and what the decline curve looks like?
I think so. I think they look at information like the IEA, but you'll know from here there are other companies that aren't as convinced, and they think the transition will be even slower. So what we're hearing from our clients is they're looking for flexibility, right? Recognizing that the transition, it's uncertain. Is it 5 years, 10 years, 15? What does that look like? But more on the bite-sized pieces, on the relationships they have with their customers. What are the investments I have to make now to give myself optionality to make the bigger investment a few years from now, and then maybe make the really big investment 10 years from now? So a lot of it is about options, having open options, starting to build the capability, starting to understand the risks of investment, and looking for demand signals. So I think a lot of our clients are looking at, I talked about sustainable aviation fuel, right? That's going to be a really big demand signal that happens in regions and in geographies based on airlines and regulators and governments working with airlines. So that's something I think our hydrocarbon players are looking at, saying, okay, well, how can we participate in this, and what does this look like? And we need to build capability. We need to understand what this looks like, and then be ready to respond and make investments if the demand is there. And it really is finding those demand signals, being prepared for them, and then watching them over time.
Are we seeing oil companies begin to pivot to low carbon business models? It seems like lately, particularly here in Canada with Suncor's announcement 3 weeks ago, that they're kind of retrenching around their core business model, and they've maybe put the low carbon business models on the side temporarily at least.
I do think they have a lot of balance within their portfolio right now, and day in, day out, they're trying to make decisions, again, to keep the options open. So some companies are looking at financial performance right now. The market is measuring them on what they're delivering to their customers and what their financial performance is today and this week. So they're trying to manage fiduciary responsibility on a public company and make sure that they're delivering to shareholders like that, but again, keeping the options open. So I think when we hear messages like that, it's a signal that, the demand that's out there is real, our clients are asking for. We have to try and make sure that we meet that demand and do it efficiently and do it at a good cost. But the companies that we're working with, they're all looking in lower carbon alternatives. They're all spending time. And I talked about, they're not building the $10 billion facility today, but what they are doing is starting to build capabilities, starting to build understanding inside, understand what the demand is, because they might be entering into more biofuels, and those biofuels have a different market and feedstock. How do they understand what that looks like? It's not the business that they did in the last 10 years, so they need to bring their capabilities up internally, also work with their board and help the board understand, like, there's an investment decision that'll come at some point in the future, and you need to understand this is what we're learning about the risks. Here's the new skills that we brought into the organization to understand the bio component of a biofuel, for example. So I think those investments are happening. It's just not the big $10 billion bets yet, because demand signals are a little slow, and we're seeing a lot of regulatory, like we got to figure out CCS, right? So you've heard some big stuff from the Alberta government here this time on carbon capture and sequestration, and some big notices from them in the last week, which tells us it's like, okay, we're starting to move the regulatory process forward. We now understand it a little bit better, and that's going to unleash the next decisions with companies to say, like, okay, well, now we can actually start talking about more than just a pilot. Let's advance our projects and do them in earnest.
Would it be fair to say that we're on the part of the adoption curve for clean energy technologies where it's disruptive, but it's still not clear where the trends are going and what timelines will be attached to those trends, and so the oil companies are they're trying to surf this wave of uncertainty? Is that?
Absolutely. I love the talk of an adoption curve, because absolutely. We have some of our technologies that might be more advanced and more mature, some that are really exciting but less mature. Maybe the one that we're working on that's less mature might be the better one for the day in 5 years from now. So I think what we're finding is it's interesting, because our energy companies are now even heavier into clean tech than they ever have been before, because they're looking at these new businesses. And you're right, they're seeing great new technologies come, and which one is going to be the right solution for our geography, for our regulatory setup, or for our products, for example. It is a little bit tricky right now, so we are having like really interesting innovation and technology readiness type work with companies, because they're trying to understand exactly that, surfing the wave that you called it of the adoption curve and what that looks like. So some are a little bit more mature, some are not, but they got to spend the time and effort to understand and de-risk all of them.
What about domestic companies in Canada, particularly in Alberta? This is the epicenter of the oil and gas industry in Canada. The oil sands is the big player on the oil side. How are the oil sands companies thinking about the energy transition?
Well, oil sands have been quite frank and honest with Pathways, their big investment that they have in Pathways and that organization, and hope you get a chance to visit them this week. They've got a very ambitious plan around how they're looking at their own emissions, how they're making themselves relevant into the 20 and 30 and 40 year time frame. So I think those are really exciting things that are coming out of the oil sands. And it is about, like, what are those emissions today, and how do we make it cleaner, and how do we manage water and land use and everything better. So they made great strides and continue to do that a lot. Another thing that's really interesting, because you talked about the oil and gas space, is actually the natural gas sector in Canada, right? It's quite robust right now. We're seeing really strong demand signals for more natural gas as a transition fuel. We're seeing people coming off coal into natural gas while they figure out how to get good base loads and support the power sector with their decisions around renewables, wind, and then what's that base load that we can handle when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, and what is that mix? So I think natural gas is seen as a really big alternative across all of North America, and we're seeing robust investment in that space, I think, because the recognition that that's going to be a very strong transition fuel for the power sector in the coming decades.
What about LNG and natural gas? I mean, this has been a talking point for a long time in Canada. The Alberta Premier, Danielle Smith, is promoting this, night and day. Are we likely to see any final investment decisions on West Coast LNG projects in the near future?
You made the comment, and it is. We have been talking about LNG for a long time. There's a great big project that's being built right now that should come on, but your comment about the next ones, I was at LNG 2023, which was in Vancouver here this summer. I left there way more energized on the LNG sector than I did going in. And it was because, the skepticism of, we've talked about a lot of projects, we've tried to get so many done, these are really complicated things to get commercially together. But to be honest, the energy that was in the room and pardon the pun, around LNG was really significant. And it was exciting because I think what we saw at LNG 23 was Indigenous partners actually saying, we want to play a role. So where it was seen as this was one of the tough things that you had to work with and find the right stakeholders and partner with them, what we're seeing now is there's actually Indigenous groups that are partnering with industry and leading these investment decisions. So I have a lot of excitement for it. We're such a gas-rich basin. We're such a gas-rich country, knowing that this LNG could offset coal in other jurisdictions. Everybody understands that that's good. That's good for overall emissions around the globe. So I think there is a good day ahead for more LNG projects, and I'm really excited to see kind of what the next 12 months and where we see the British Columbia government, where we see the federal government working with industry and partners to try and get some of these projects off the ground.
Now, the other day I was reading a piece, it was a Bloomberg piece, about natural gas in China. And from their point of view, China has no intention of displacing coal with natural gas. Any natural gas, increase in natural gas imports will go into space heating and maybe some industry. So where is that argument coming from that natural gas in Asia, but particularly in China, would displace coal?
Well, it was certainly a lot of the business case on some of the first LNG projects here in Canada. There was discussion. Ultimately, LNG could be used for a lot of different decisions. And this actually goes to almost the first question that we talked about, is that every geography is going to be different, right? And how they, what are the levers that they pull on? I think we've heard from a lot of countries and a lot of energy ministers here so far at WPC that their geographies have unique issues, and we're going to have to work around. Alberta, we understand our power sector looks very different in Alberta than it does in British Columbia. So our options look a little bit different. And I think China looks at those options as well, because they've got a lot of growth going on in their economy, and they have a lot of heating needs, a lot of other decarbonization efforts. And what I heard from some of the contingencies here at WPC was that we're going to need all our solutions, we're going to need all our investments. They're talking hydrogen, they're talking electrification of industry, electrification of the transportation industry, biofuels. So all of them are on the map. So, what's coal going to play as a role in China? Hard to say. I'm not deep into the Chinese sector, but if they're going to look at using LNG into others, you hope it's with the idea that this is the best place for this efficient use of this fuel, and this is something that's going to lower our emissions in aggregate the most.
Yesterday during a press conference, Danielle Smith mentioned using Alberta hydrocarbons as feedstock for advanced materials manufacturing.
Yeah.
Carbon fiber,
yeah.
asphalt, all that kind of stuff. Something near and dear to Energy Media's heart. We've been advocating for that for years. So I was pleased to hear the Premier say that, but I'm wondering if there's a similar sentiment on part of the companies. Are they looking at investing money into building carbon fiber precursor plants, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. The stories are long of Alberta and the desire to not just export natural gas and crude oil to the U.S. We're always looking for different sales points, and we're also looking at other ways to bring value add into Canada. This has been a long challenge. I think what happens is at each turn when an industry is really like making new moves and new investments and thinking about broader portfolios, that's the time when that stuff can happen, right? That's when the new contracts get signed. That's when new demand start to build up. We saw big petrochemical investments coming into Alberta here in the last 5 or 6 years on the backs of some of the government initiatives. But it was exactly that. It was a new market had started to form. This is something we should look at, and the recognition that Alberta is looking at deploying capital in. So I think there does seem to be a lot of excitement around it, and especially as you look at carbon capture, carbon that's going to be, what are we going to do with the carbon? All of a sudden there is going to be, again, a new business and a new opportunity to say, hey, we're going to be advantaged because we have it here. Are there things that we can do with it, add some value, and get it out to the market? And then, in Canada, the big question is always going to be, where's the market? and how do we transport it, and how do we get it there, right? But those are the wrinkles that come with it. But every time there's this new investment cycle or this, added portfolio options that happen in companies is when these come to the surface, and there's the opportunity to start to look at value adding in Alberta.
Final question, Andrew, and that is this conflict between the provincial government in Alberta here and the federal government over things like oil and gas emission cap and other kinds of regulation. My take on this is that the federal government wants to see significant progress in the 2020s. The industry is basically saying, look, we would prefer to do it in the 2030s. There's all kinds of technology that we think will be more mature then, SMRs, CCUS, and so on. It's better for us, it's more cost effective, it's more efficient to put it off a little bit till the technology is a little mature. The federal government is focused on its emission reduction targets.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to frame this conversation?
Yeah, I think what really stood out, there was a minister's conversation yesterday, and it was Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, right? Three provinces that have really similar views on energy and what it does for their economies. I think what I hear from that is the need to recognize what some of the complications are in each of the geographies, and that there isn't one solution that it's going to work across Canada. We have great complexity in Atlantic Canada all the way through to British Columbia. Some are highly advantaged in some areas with hydro. Others are advantaged with things like oil and natural gas like Alberta and, British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, right? So Newfoundland with its offshore has a really interesting portfolio as well. So I think it seems that most of the friction and most of the conversations are around the one solution may not work across Canada. So let's really think through how complex these energy system changes are, and recognize that we got to give some flexibility to each of the regions to try and find the way that they can deploy capital the best, get industry partners along to do it, because this needs industry participation to bring it along, especially in an open competitive market. Like, for example, the Alberta power market is very different than the rest of the country, right? So recognizing that there's some geography issues and realizing that there isn't just one solution, and we need to talk about them all, and we need to do the work and the science and figure out what are the decisions, what are the no regret decisions that we can make now to start to handle emissions immediately, and then what are the ones that we want to position ourselves, much like our energy players are looking at their big portfolios and figuring out how do we give ourselves the options analysis and start to do that. So, and it is about, ultimately boils down to deploying capital, and people need to deploy capital to do it, and some of these things are very expensive and require a lot of work to be done.
Andrew, one final question.
Okay.
And what are the top two issues that you see affecting the Alberta oil and gas industry over the next 2 to 5 years?
Well, I think the big issue is balance right now, because demand signals out there are asking our energy companies to deliver more and to meet that global demand. And at the same time, all our companies have agreed that they want to try and handle emissions, lower emissions, and develop that effectively as well, right? So I think that balance and how we're making those decisions in and out, that's going to be the big push, that one trend that we're going to feel a lot over the next 5 years. And I think the other one is just, again, it's how do companies keep the options open? How do they do the investments now? How do they bring capabilities in so that they are ready for the investment in 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years from now? Understand SMRs, for example, that you talked about. Bringing in capability to understand what that looks like in our market. So I think it's going to be, our energy companies are getting into a whole lot of new businesses and bringing capability up with those as well.
Andrew, thank you.
Good, thanks a lot, Mark.